Welcome to the bright side of 50. Hey, y'all. Hey, welcome to another episode of The Bright Side of 50 with Carla Palmer. Thank you so much. As always, thank you for being here. I can't thank you enough. I know I say thank you all the time. Thank you. I'm super excited. It's true. I'm super excited and super grateful that you tune in to this podcast. I had a podcast episode, I think it was a couple episodes ago, where I was talking about I don't have a ton of followers on my podcast. And it's okay. It's okay that I don't have a ton of followers. And at some point, perhaps it will grow. Maybe it won't. I believe that it will if I continue to be consistent. I believe that it will grow at some point. But right now, I don't have a ton of followers. But let me tell you something. I think that I operate with a lot of class. I have a clean podcast that I think anybody would be fine coming on. I don't think that I would embarrass anyone if somebody had a huge audience and I invited them to my podcast and they said yes and they came on. I believe that they would have a decent experience. I also know that everybody can't say yes because they have to decide what's right for their brand and they have to decide what's right for their time. Like, I totally understand that. But I have had people who have said yes to being on the podcast, have set up a time. This is my time as well, okay? Set up a time to come and actually do the recording and didn't show up. Was sent a reminder and said, oh, I'm sorry, I missed it. I was busy or something else came up, and they just didn't show. And then rescheduled, and I don't really do this anymore, but rescheduled and didn't show up again, right? Because I'm just that little podcast over there to some people. Oh, she didn't have a lot of followers on her podcast. If I show up, great. If not, it's whatever. You wouldn't do that if it were a big podcaster. You would make the time, you would put it in your calendar, and you would show up. And I say that to say that we should treat everybody like they're important, right? This is something that I am doing because I love doing it. And if I want you on, that means that I feel like you have something valuable to add to my audience, and I respect you. And if you decide that you have something better to do and you decide that you just don't have to show up and you don't have to let me know, or I can just reschedule, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. I have a lot of self-respect. I have a lot of respect for my brand. And I expect for anyone I invite to be a guest on my podcast to have the same level of respect for me, for themselves, because to me, you're hurting your brand by just completely blowing me off and treating it like it's just not an important thing. Then I look at you a certain way after that. I look at you a certain way. And that's just the way that life works. If you commit to something, commit, show up, respect the person that you committed to, whatever it is. But for now, I'm talking about the podcast. Let me tell you something. Even if somebody has a little podcast, that little podcast over there, some great things can come out of that little podcast over there. I'm going to give you an example. And it didn't necessarily come off of my podcast, but I was listening to a wonderful podcast last year. And it was a small podcast, not a lot of followers, probably about the same as mine, maybe even less than the Bright Side of 50. But it was a great podcast. And I loved it. And I would always tune in. I don't think she's doing any episodes right now, but I would always tune in. And so one day I tuned in and she had a wonderful guest on that podcast. And this guest was a career coach. She was a career coach for midlife women. And she was a executive career coach. So it was very specific. Executive career coach for women in midlife who were either trying to make a transition to another company or a different sector, or she was trying to, or she does, sorry, not trying, she does, or she was supporting women in leadership who wanted to promote in their jobs, or they wanted to just become better leaders. Okay. So that's her skill set. She's skilled at this. So I was listening to this little podcast that she was on, and I just loved her delivery. I loved the way that she talked about how she supported women. And I saw myself as a potential client for this woman. I saw myself as a potential client. And I reached out to her on LinkedIn after she was on this episode and providing all this amazing information and tips and tricks on how to be a better leader or grow as a leader or, transition to another sector or another career. I loved it. And so I reached out to her on LinkedIn and I said, hey, I really enjoyed your episode on XYZ podcast. And she said, oh, you listened to it. That was amazing. And she followed up really quickly when I DM'd her on LinkedIn. We connected. I sent a connection. She accepted the connection and we became connected on LinkedIn. And then she says, oh, I see that you have a podcast. I need to check out your podcast. And I said, okay. Now I'm thinking, I don't know if she would come on my podcast, but yes, check it out. I would love to have her on and have her bring the same level of value that she brought to the other podcast. So she checked out the podcast and she followed up with me and she said, I'd love to be a guest on your podcast, basically, if you'll have me kind of thing. And I'm thinking to myself, of course I will have you on the podcast. Now, she did come on the podcast, but it was on the podcast before we started doing a video podcast. And so I'll have to bring her on again because I think you guys need to get the full Tabitha. Her name is Tabitha. And I think you just need to get like the full Tabitha and not just the audio. She's absolutely amazing. And so anyway, I say that to say we set up a time to talk outside of her being on the podcast, talk more about the work that she does and talk more about how she supports these women in midlife and how she sets up her programming and one-on-one coaching. She has group coaching, right? She has different packages that you can do. Hey, sis. Hey, I just wanted to take a moment to ask you, have you subscribed to The Bright Side of 50 with Carla Palmer? If you have not, could you please take a moment, if you like the podcast, take a moment now to hit the subscribe button so that you become a subscriber, turn on your notifications so that you're notified when a new episode drops, okay? Also, follow me on Instagram. I am The Bright Side of 50 over there on Instagram too. Thank you so much. Now I'll let you get back to the episode. Let me tell you something. Because she said yes to go on that little podcast that she went on, because she responded to little old me on LinkedIn, and because she came on to my podcast and added great value, I basically just fell in love with this woman and all that she brings to the table. She is now my coach. I have spent tens of thousands of dollars on coaching with this woman. She's an amazing executive coach. I have grown as a leader, having worked with Tabitha. And I would not know Tabitha if Tabitha hadn't said yes to being on this little podcast that I heard her on. She wasn't too good for that little podcast. And I'm calling it a little podcast. I don't see it in that way, but I know that other people see those of us who don't have large audiences. They often see us as those little people with those little podcasts, not understanding that there are great things that can come out of being on that little podcast. So not only did I sign up with this woman to be my coach, one-on-one coaching, last year, I just signed up to coach with her for another 6 months. All right. So that little podcast that she was on made her some little money. Okay. So stop turning your nose up. And I'm not talking to those of you who don't. But if you are one of those people who doesn't see the big picture or doesn't see people who are trying their best to add value to the world and do things regardless of 1 follower or 3 followers or 5 million followers, we can still add value. And we shouldn't be looked down upon because we don't have a lot of people in our network on our podcast. There's still a lot of good that can come out of that. Just ask Tabitha, because Tabitha knew what was up. And my question for you is, do you know what's up? Are you looking down on people who don't have big following? Are you looking down on people on social media who may have amazing messages, but they have 160 followers and not 160,000 followers, or not even 16,000 followers? There's still a good message that people have. It doesn't mean that they're less than the popular kids, the cool kids, as people see. There's a lot that we can learn from this experience that I'm sharing with you. All right. There's a lot that we can all learn. And I'm sure, I'm sure that there have been times in the past when I have respect for everybody, but I think that there are times when I have valued people with larger audiences more than I would people with fewer followers. And this whole experience that I'm talking about, my own personal experience with watching Tabitha on this podcast, connecting with her on LinkedIn, having her on my podcast, and then hiring her as my executive coach. Listen, there's a lot we can all learn from this. So I thought I would share that with you. And I want to know from you, what do you think about this episode? What do you think about this topic? What do you think about this experience? This is, if there's no other episode that you've felt like you should share out this one. And you should share out this one, not just because you're supporting me with the share, but because I think it will help other people. It will help other people who are podcasting, who don't have big audiences. I think it will help people see them differently. It will help the person who is, out there asking people to come on to their podcast. Because listen, if I ask somebody with 160,000 followers to come on my podcast, and maybe they have products and services that they offer, they hear this podcast episode, they should say yes, because you never know who could be listening to my little episode. Even if it's that one person that tunes in and hears what you are offering, podcast products and services wise, you could get a business from that. Right? Or you could get some kind of connection from that. I've had people on my podcast, a lady on my podcast who is a financial advisor, and she sells insurance. And she had someone reach out to her after she was on my podcast to come and do a workshop for young people, I believe at a church, because she shared while she was on my podcast that she does work with young women, young men in her church. Right? So let's treat everybody the same. Let's not look at influencers or influential people with large audiences as better than, or someone you should respect more than us little people over here with our little podcast. Because I believe that we too have a lot of value to add to this world, to this podcasting world, just to the world in general. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it was insightful. Yeah. Let me know what you think. All right. And I will see you soon. Thank you so much for being here, like I said. And I'll see you on the next episode of The Bright Side of 50 with Carla Palmer. Take care.